All right. So thus far, what we've done is, I mean, apart from all the wider observations and general observations, I've looked at the two main monarchs, and then I moved down to the third monarch, that's Chandragupta II, who reigns from 385 to 415, also known as Vikram Aditya. Vikram Aditya is the son of valor. There are several kings in India by that name, so it can get a little confusing if one is not really careful with that. But Chandragupta II is one way in which he's known. And remember that you also have Chandragupta Maurya, but that's the Mauryan Empire, right? And then you have his grandfather Chandragupta, and his father, of course, Chandragupta II was Samudragupta. We do have a literary source which talks about him. This literary source is called the Devi Chandraguptam by Vishaka Datta, which suggests that he displaced his brother Ramagupta. You remember that Chandragupta the second reigns from 380, as this slide shows you, but that Samudragupta, his reign finished in 375 when he died. And then I said there's a period of this 5 years when you have what you might call a disputed kingship. All right. There's a very interesting set of circumstances. It would take really very long to get into the details of that. But I want to give you just a little glimpse of it because it tells you a little bit about the making of history. What are some of the politics of writing history, right? Other than, for example, the question of Orientalism that we've discussed, and you know, I've discussed with you many times the whole problem of communalism using this template of religious animosity from the present, and then you know, and then making the inference that this kind of religious animosity existed way back in remote antiquity, a view that I've suggested we have to really reject. Right? So this is what I mean when I speak about the politics of writing history. Now, you see, there's been, the thing is that the Guptas became known, as I have argued repeatedly, became known as a kind of an exemplary king empire, exemplary set of kings, you know, that they revive Hindu kingship, there's religious toleration, you know, that they entertain. There's the flowering of Indian literature. There's fabulous developments in linguistics and astronomy and mathematics. And, you know, the general impression seems to be that this was a very good time. I mean, that quotation by A.L. Bhasham at the very beginning, you know, that this civilization, that India was more happy at this time under this civilization than any other part of the world was at this time. And India was happier at this time than it has ever been, either before or, you know, since the Guptas, right? So then we find this little unsavory thing. And that unsavory thing is that that there seems to be some suggestion in this text that Chandragupta II lusted for his brother's wife and may possibly have killed him. And you know, that was it, because that was the disputed succession, right? And then we find that most Indian historians reject the story. But the question is, why do they reject it? Do they reject it because the evidence is not convincing enough? Because if you say it's not convincing enough, then you say, well, we've got a large amount of evidence which stacks up on the other side. Well, we don't really. What we do have is we have this text which suggests that he may have killed his brother and then taken possession of his brother's wife. And you will also remember here something very interesting, which is go back to the story of Vali and Sugriv and the Ramayana, right? Two brothers, and then, you know, one brother, monkey, kills the other one, then he takes possession of his wife. And of course, remember that there again you have, you know, the character of Ram, who then enters into the story because he is going to take Sugriv's side without actually having listened to Vali explain his own interpretation of the events, right? So there's something of that obvious, and I think that some Indian historians, I think, perhaps felt somewhat at unease with this story, so they rejected it. But there's a very interesting article which sort of looks at some of this in detail which I've given as a reference here. And this PowerPoint was already shared with you, in that huge portfolio that I'd sent. You have the reference here. This JBORS is the Journal of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Society. Okay, but if you type in A.S. Altekar, a new Gupta king, into Google, it will immediately give you the full citation of the journal and all of that, and you should be able to access that article. Now Chandragupta II thought of himself also as an Orthodox Hindu, and I think that that's what makes it even a little more uncomfortable. And this assessment is from a book by Radha Kumud Mukherjee called The Gupta Empire. So Radha Kumud Mukherjee was a generation of very important Indian historians, largely forgotten today. Really writing in the first half of the 20th century, writing in the 20s, 30s, 40s. I'll take this person over here is another one. And these are people who really became interested in dynasties such as the Guptas because they were trying to understand whether there was some notion of a Hindu republic. All right. I mean, I'm mentioning this because that's actually critically important in many ways. Why so? Because if you take the institution of modern democracy, the question is, yes, we know that democracy in its modern form, right? So in India, we know that most of our institutions have been inherited from Great Britain. The parliamentary system was inherited from Great Britain, for example, right? Having the two houses of parliament, the Lok Sabha, the Rajya Sabha. So in Britain, you have the House of Commons, you have the House of Lords. In the United States, you have, again, a bicameral legislature. You have the House of Representatives, you have the Senate. And it has been suggested, of course, that actually, in some ways, the origins of these forms of democracy really are ancient Greece. Not that there's a straight line that you can draw there, but that there was some notion of democratic participation in Greece. So the question is, did we have some kind of notion of democratic participation in India? What was the nature of the polity? Because when we speak about the reign of such and such king, then we say that, well, that's who reigned. But how was politics conducted on the ground? Right? What was the nature of participation by the people? And that's a question that I will again return to in just momentarily. But I'm suggesting to you that these historians are actually a very interesting group of historians that we have completely neglected, because what they were interested in doing, and that's one of the reasons they went back to the Guptas, not only because the Guptas were viewed as a great Hindu, dynasty and all of that, but because I think there was supposition that there was some element of what we might call people's participation in some sense of the term. All right, and this is one reason why these kings had to be observant of certain kinds of social and political protocols. And that might be one reason why this story of Chandragupta having killed his brother and then having taken possession of his wife and effectively having usurped the throne had to be rejected, because it cast a kind of an unsavory look at Chandragupta, and therefore would have suggested this was not a man of democratic propensities, right? But on the other hand, there may be some evidence which points to what we might call a certain kind of political structure which facilitated democratic participation, possibly. All right. Now, it is under Chandragupta II that the empire attains its greatest territorial expanse. Now, I know I had made that claim for Samudragupta, but I made it only in the sense there that the expansion is really the greatest. That you have the core area, then Samudragupta is really the one who brings the largest chunk of territory into the empire. Samudragupta is going to add to it, but the portion that he adds is a relatively smaller portion. So what the real onus for him, the real duty he had, was to maintain the territorial integrity of that empire and to some extent add it. And what he's going to do here is that you see his daughter Prabhavati Gupta is going to marry Rudrasena II of the central Indian dynasty, the Vakatakas. So if you look at that map that I'd shown you before, you will recall what I mean by this. So this is the Vakataka. So Chandragupta II is going to marry the daughter of the ruler of the Vakataka. So that's what's going to forge the political alliance even further. All right. And this strategy, as I've suggested, is also a strategy of military expansion, which is being wedded to strategic martial alliances. We can look at other political details, such as the triumph over the Shakas in Gujarat, which means that now the territorial expansions have gone all the way west to modern day Gujarat. And as I've suggested to you, you find, as in the case of Samudragupta, you find some of the conquests are going to be inscribed on an iron pillar, this time the iron pillar at Meroli. So this is not the Ashokan pillar, which was what we found in the case of the of Samudragupta, but rather the iron pillar, which is a pillar that you find even today, about which there's been a lot of speculation, because this pillar goes back to a period, which would suggest a very advanced state of metallurgy, essentially. That's what we're really speaking about, because this pillar hasn't rusted. That's the key point here, that we're speaking about a pillar that stood for something like 2,000 years and still hasn't rusted. All right. This court that he is going to gather around him, he's going to, typically monarchs will do that. Modern day democratic presidents always also do it, when the modern way that we do it. I always use analogies because we need to try to understand what these things mean. That in India, one of the things that every political administration tries to do is it tries to get people of great artistic, intellectual eminence to collaborate with that political administration in some way. They will honor these people. They might give them the Bharat Ratna. That's, of course, done very rarely in India, but they might give them the Padma Vibhushan or the Padma Bhushan. These are various kinds of honors. In those days, you would bring people to the court, and then they would become part of the court. So what you have there is that the Navratna, as they're called, the 9 jewels, and that included the astronomer Aryabhat and Kalidas. So these, Kalidas is that great playwright that I've mentioned. These people are brought to the court, and they add luster, they add brilliance to the regime, right? That's to the kingdom. Now, we have a very interesting source. That is the travel diary of Fa Hien. The name is spelled in several different names, who is said to have lived between 337 to 422 approximately of the Common Era. He travels through South Asia from 399 to 412 with a party of Chinese pilgrims and scholars. So he's not coming alone. And he's coming there, so he's referred to as a pilgrim because he's a Buddhist. And as is the case for Buddhist pilgrims today, a visit to India becomes important because they want to go to the place where the Buddha gained nirvana, where he gained enlightenment, where he gave his first sermon, right? So, all these places, Nalanda, Varanasi or Banaras, Bodh Gaya, they all become important as within the Buddhist pilgrimage network. So for him, India is the fount of wisdom. It is the source of wisdom, the source of enlightenment, the source of spiritual satisfaction. He's also interested in acquiring manuscripts of texts. And this is singularly important because we have a substantial number of Buddhist texts which are going to be lost in India. And though the translations were done from Pali or from Sanskrit into Chinese, the original manuscripts didn't survive, or the works didn't even survive at all in any Sanskrit Pali manuscript, but they survived in Chinese translation. So, fortunately for us, these travelers who are coming from China, and we have a number of them over a period of several centuries, take back hordes of, these texts and other relics. And these works are then going to be translated, and so many of these texts are going to be available in these translations when they are no longer available in the original language. His travels, because he leaves behind quite a voluminous record, furnish a record of the state of Buddhism in India and offer incontrovertible evidence that Buddhism was certainly in decline at this time. He will tell you that if you go to such and such place, he was told that there used to be, for example, 10,000 monks, and then 100 years ago, but that when he arrives there and is speaking, he is told that the number of monks has declined to 2,000. Right? I'm just giving you a random number to illustrate the nature of the argument, because that would suggest that kings have withdrawn their patronage. And one of the reasons why they've withdrawn their patronage is that the Guptas revive Hindu kingship. So there's a revival of Hinduism. Popular Hinduism is going to start to come into shape around this period of time. And what we're saying very directly is that there is a relationship between the emergence of what becomes known as common popular Hinduism and the decline of Buddhism to a certain degree. All right. That this patronage that used to be extended to Buddhist monasteries is now being extended to Hindu temples and Indian Hindu temples and institutions. And what his text gives us is some idea of the socioeconomic conditions of the Gangetic Plains. This map here shows you, it's a sketch map of his travels through India. And, so he's starting out here and going along this way. Remember, this is all on foot, by the way. You're going in through extremely rugged mountainous terrain. We salute people who have climbed Everest. Now they've become dime a dozen, if I may put it this way. You may have read last year there was a traffic jam to reach the summit. You had to wait in line to reach the summit of Everest for 3 hours. But think about, and modern day mountaineers, I mean, these are people who are going with, they're going with oxygen. I know that Everest has even been done without oxygen now, but most of them with oxygen. They're going with super advanced mountaineering boots and equipment. You're talking about someone who's just traveling there, with a large flock of animals. I mean, the animals are taken because they're going to bring back manuscripts, and they're all going to be brought back on the back of donkeys and other animals, right? And going through the mountain passes, right? This route, and we're talking about journeys which took place over a period of a number of years, and then he spends a number of years in India. This is what we're really speaking about. This little interior map shows you, because then he's going to continue further down. Eventually going to go on boat part of the way and then head back over this way. We're not interested in that part of it. What we're interested is, what did he see here? This is Magadha over here. You see this kind of circuit, this circuit here, suggesting that he actually crisscrossed this area quite carefully, because this is where you see the greatest density of movement, is in this area around Magadha. Magadha was, of course, the place that, as we've seen for several centuries now, had been the seat of political power. There'd be all right. So here's another map, but we don't need to really pause over this. So here's a quotation. We're going to pause a few minutes to look at this, because it's extraordinarily interesting. So he says, all south from Mathura is named the Middle Kingdom, and its cold and heat are finely tempered, and there's neither hoarfrost nor snow. Hoarfrost is, I'm not sure exactly what it means. I didn't look it up, but I think it means frost on the ground of some kind. The people are numerous and happy. They have not to register their households. So the kingdom doesn't require that people have to be registered. there are some more details over here. The king governs without decapitation or other corporal punishments. Okay, that is that this seems to suggest that the king had what we might call relatively advanced ideas that you don't actually stop crime by inflicting corporal punishment. Criminals are simply fined lightly or heavily according to the circumstance of each case. Even in cases of repeated attempts at wicked rebellion, they only have their right hands cut off. And you might think to yourself that that's a fairly draconian punishment. To the contrary, it's a very light punishment, because in almost every country in the world at that time, if citizens engaged in rebellion, they would almost always be killed immediately, right? The king's bodyguards and attendants all have salaries. Throughout the whole country, the people do not kill any living creature, nor drink intoxicating liquor, nor eat onions or garlic. The only exception is that of the Chandalas. Now, I put this in bold because when I saw this, I think I knew at once when I first saw it what was really going on here, because I think you would agree that this is a most unusual description. You know, if you're describing the Middle Kingdom and you've got a paragraph there, and then you say, hey, these people don't eat onions or garlic, and they don't drink intoxicating liquor, you know, as though if someone came to the United States, spent 3 years there, and then give a paragraph long description and said, well, you know, they have a democratic system of government, and what I've also noted is that Americans don't like broccoli, right? So then you would say to yourself, well, what on earth is really going on? See, what he's saying here is that the people here seem to be Vaishnavas. These are people who are Vaishnavas, because Vaishnavas, or certainly very broadly speaking, that this is a domain which is largely vegetarian. These people are vegetarian. And if you look at this quotation here, the people do not kill any living creature, nor drink intoxicating liquor, nor eat onions or garlic. And you look at this in relationship to the other portion that I'd highlighted before, that the king governs without decapitation or other corporal punishment, it would suggest that the idea of ahimsa or non-violence had really taken hold. And this may have been initially owing to the influence of Buddhism, but that now this had become absorbed into the ethos of Hinduism, and in particular Vaishnavism, because the Vaishnavas, we had a long discussion of that. I remember that there's this whole, idea of vegetarianism, of course, among the Jains as well, but the idea here was that onions and garlics, one of the reasons you don't eat them is because they have a very strong smell. Also, they have roots, right? And generally those vegetables, when you pluck it from the roots, you may end up killing, insects and ants and so on. But also onions and garlic have a very strong smell, as does meat. So the vegetarianism is actually a worldview which is also about the sense of smell, although we don't usually understand it in that way. That is an element of that narrative of vegetarians. All right. This is what is really striking. You see that they do not kill any living creature. That you're talking about some view of ahimsa, and you're speaking about the spread of vegetarianism in at least the middle, what he calls a middle kingdom, by which he means Aryavart, that is the heartland of India, the Gangetic Plains. All the area, that is now encompassed by Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, moving into Eastern Bengal, going into Calcutta. The only exception is that of the Chandalas being the untouchables, the fifth caste, all right? The Panchamas, because the untouchables will eat any of that. All these taboos are all upper caste taboos. And then he says that is a name for those who are held to be wicked men. What makes them wicked? It's not their theological views as such, but the fact that they consume liquor, the chandalas, that they will eat onions, they will eat garlic, and they will eat flesh. When they enter the gate of a city or a marketplace, they strike a piece of wood to make themselves known, which is what Manav Dharma Shastra mentions, the Manusmriti. That, you know, when an upper caste person is approaching, and this is, by the way, has been seen in South Indian towns in relatively recent times. All right. 20th century writers who've observed this, that in some in South Indian towns, when a Brahmin was approaching and a Shudra was there, the Shudra was obligated to ring a bell so that he could let the Brahmin know that I'm coming down the road. All right. Or if he's sitting there and a Brahmin is coming, then letting the Brahmin know I'm here beforehand. And you want to make sure I'm letting you know because you don't want to get polluted. You know, all right? So what this is suggesting is that by this time, by the 4th century, by circa 400, approximately 400, let's just take that as a date here, by circa 400, the social conditions had become, if I may put it this way, they had become more rigorous. Okay, they had become more confining for all the castes. The Brahmins had confining because they had to be very careful about getting polluted. They were becoming even more careful. They were becoming obsessive and paranoid about it. And the Shudras, of course, would suffer the consequences if they were viewed as having polluted the Brahmins, right? So this is what we can really, you know, infer from his comments. All right, and the latter portion of that again reinforces it. There are no butcher shops. Only the chandalas are fishermen and hunters and sell flesh meat. Now, he also says something which is very interesting. And I said, remember, circa 400, so circa 400, 405, that he says, and this is another quotation from the text, and the portion that he's describing as a portion from the text, it's quite clear that this is a portion close to modern day Patna, right? What would have been Patliputra at that time. The inhabitants are rich and prosperous and vie with one another the practice of benevolence and righteousness. So in other words, people, you know, the people who live there, they're well off, and each of them gives money to charity or to temples, and each of them tries to outdo the other. They vie with one another, compete with one another. The heads of the Vaishya families establish houses for dispensing charity and medicines. All the poor and destitute in the country, orphans, widowers, and childless men, maimed people and cripples, and all who are diseased go to those houses. Right? What is he talking about? And when they go to those houses, the doctors examine them, they're provided with help, they get the food and the medicines they need. What he's saying, if you transpose it to modern terms, the Guptas had developed a social safety net. The social safety net. It may be too much to say that India under the Guptas was a social welfare state. That's how we describe modern European states today, such as France and Germany and Sweden and Denmark and Norway, right? They're social welfare states. You know, there are goods in common. Education is largely free. You pay taxes, and therefore you get covered by the medical system for medical treatment. There's public transportation. These are social welfare states. What he's suggesting is that for that time, this was something like a social welfare state. Right? We don't have really much evidence to contradict it. And of course, whether this is sufficient to say that this was really the case, it's difficult to conjecture, but this is what the text tells us. Right? Yeah. And as I often remark, I wish we had a social security net of this kind today. We don't have anything remotely resembling this in India today. It's like the drainage system in the Indus Valley civilization, which seems to be much better than the drainage system of modern India city. Just wait for the rains to come in Bombay and you'll know exactly what I mean. You know, so now you have developments in mathematics and astronomy in India at this time. It's quite possible that chess may have been invented in India just around this time. Some people have given a possibly different origin. I would say the largest number of scholars would agree with the assessment that chess was invented in India. The pieces all seem to have a relationship to the kind of army that you had. So, Indian armies had elephants. You had chariots, that's the rook in modern chess. You have the infantry, the pawns, right, as they're called in chess today, and then you have the cavalry, which is a horse. Uh, so it's quite possible that the pieces and how they were thought of was actually inherited from the practice of war. In algebra, the use of letters of the alphabet to denote unknown quantities, this came about in India at this point in time. When we use XYZ to denote unknown quantities in algebra, which is done all the time. So if you have 2x equals 6, well, x, what is x? X is 3, right? So that use of this letters of the alphabet to denote unknown quantities originates in India around this time, as did the decimal place value system. I think if you read modern day histories of mathematics written in the 20th century and beyond, I think most of them will acknowledge this at this point in time. That was not the case, in the 19th century, but certainly today, that is, I think, widely acknowledged. The use of zero in India, which had been in use around 200 BCE, zero is referred to as shunya. This is clearly spelled out in the text, which is known as the Aryabhatiya, which dates to about 500 CE. Okay, so a little bit after what you might describe as the heyday of the Guptas, but it's still the Gupta period, but it's a little bit after the heyday of the Guptas. The text could have been a little bit earlier, but it's certainly a Gupta period text. And in this, he has a line where he says, stanat, stanam, dashagunam syat. From place to place, each is 10 times the preceding, right? So that's the decimal place value system, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. From place to place, each is 10 times the preceding. And then there are more accomplishments in mathematics, which are described in greater detail by people who have looked at the role of mathematics in India today. And again, here I've given a brief abbreviation for the journal, but all you have to do is just type in the name Ingalls and Journal of the American Oriental Society, and you'll come up with the exact citation. But I can let you know that if you ever have any problem, once you start looking into it, if you get around to doing that at some point, you just drop me a line, and I can give you access to these pieces. So I've spoken about Kalidas a number of times, the greatest playwright produced by India by common consensus. Lives from the late 4th century to the mid 5th century CE. The chronology is a bit uncertain. We cannot be entirely certain of the dates, but he most likely lived between 390 and 470 CE. One of the cities that he describes as a flourishing city is Ujjain. And Ujjain was destroyed by the Huns. So the Huns are coming from Central Asia. We'll get to them in 15, 20 minutes when we come to the end. The Huns had destroyed Ujjain by 510. Since Kalidas describes it in one of his works as a flourishing city, therefore, that is one way of inferring that he lived before 510. All right? Right? Because he's described the city, and we know that by 510 it had been completely destroyed. So he could not have given that kind of description, that detailed description of the city, which he did in one of his works. The number of works he writes is not very large. We're really talking about a handful of works. One is the Ritu Samhara, which is a poem describing 6 cycles of seasons. The most famous work is Shakuntala, which is a play. I will not attempt to offer a summary of the play because that will take too long to get into all the details of the play, but some of the way in which he did the staging, what's called the proscenium, the actual stage and how you stage it. This is something that is going to be very influential for European playwrights, and the greatest name in the history of European literary humanism, that is Goethe, right? He is going to feast on this work because it's going to be translated into English. It's also going to be translated into French and German. And Goethe is going to become familiar with the work circa 1800. And the translations are important, not only because they bring Kalidas to the attention of Europeans, but because really some of these translations are among the earliest works to be translated, along with the Upanishads, with the Bhagavad Gita, and a few other works. Among the earliest works which really, in some ways, brings ancient India within the orbit of European intellectual thinking. And that period from 1780 to 1830 is a period when the greatest figures in Europe, many of them, I would say the majority of them, started acquiring a real familiarity with Indian literature and philosophy, and many were completely enchanted. The Upanishads became highly influential for a number of European philosophers, right? But that is a longer story of the interaction of European intellectual thought with the thought of India, with the thought of ancient India in particular. And then there's another work by Kalidas which is called the Meghdut, the cloud messenger. And what it is it's a work in which basically the narration is, as it were, by a cloud, where the cloud is describing, right, one place after another. This is where you find the description of the city of Ujjain, because it's like the bird's eye view. It's like the view from the aeroplane. Right? It's an extraordinarily imaginative work, and that's what it really refers to here, is the Meghdut. All right. So this is a painting by Raja Ravi Verma. We encountered him earlier, before, when I showed you that painting from the late 19th century of Vishnu sitting astride the Garuda, the bird, the fictional bird. And this is another painting done by Raja Ravi Verma of Shakuntala, who she's walking along a path with a few of her maids or friends, and she's stopped to take a thorn out of her foot, but she's also glancing a look at Dushyant. Dushyant is the king that is going to fall for her. All right, so it's this story is going to circulate through various kinds of media in India for a very long period of time. Now we move from back to the political history, from Samudragupta and Chandragupta first and second, to essentially what is now going to become the last period of the last two great Guptas before the empire is going to start to go into decline. You'll notice the slides become shorter because we know less and less about the Guptas. Once you go past Chandragupta first and Samudragupta and Chandragupta the second, the evidence starts to diminish. All right, which also suggests that the heyday is gone. You have fewer gold coins, you have fewer inscriptions. It seems that some of the greater works have already been written now by this point in time, although they may have come into a more polished form under Kumaragupta and his successors, right? So he lives from 415, reigns from 415 to 455, a long reign. You have inscriptions in Mathura and in a place called Mandasur and MP in Madhya Pradesh. The worship of the god Kartikya is going to be introduced under him. Important development if you're looking at the long, complicated history of popular Hinduism. and the first Hun invasions start taking place. So the Huns are called the Hunas in India. The Huns are coming from Central Asia. This is a nomadic uh, 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 group of people with advanced, um, if I may put it this way, military techniques to some degree, but it's a sheer force of numbers. They come in large numbers, repeated raids, relentless. Uh, and I think it is safe to say, by the way, that India, uh, you know, notwithstanding the what would become the common legend of a country that had never been able to repel the foreign invader, that the foreign invader was always able to make his way into India very easily. Well, actually, the Guptas, the Gupta Empire, and what transpired under Kumaragupta, and even I would say for the next 50, 100 years, suggests in fact something to the contrary, because what you find is that the Huns are going to be repelled. And remember that it's the same Huns, a different branch of that family, which goes west and is responsible largely for the end of the Roman Empire. Right? That's you're talking about one of the most ferocious fighting forces known in history. But the Huns are going to be actually repelled by the Guptas, and when they eventually break through, as we're going to see in a few moments, by that point in time, the Huns themselves have become, to some degree, a shadow of who they were. So that when they finally break through India, they are not able to actually hold on to the territory, even though they have now decimated the Guptas. This is sometime after Kumaragupta, but this all begins really at the time of Kumaragupta. And what you're going to have here is the establishment of the famous Buddhist monastery. So even though Buddhism is going into decline, at the same time, there is clear evidence that there was continuing patronage, because this monastery at Nalanda is something like Taxila from several centuries ago. It is the site for students coming from large parts of Central Asia, West Asia, and even East Asia. Students coming from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, coming from China, coming from Japan, and staying there in order to learn Buddhism. So it was not simply a monastery, it was a library, it was an institution, a kind of a university. The ruins are still there to be seen. It's now a great, I think, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The ruins are still there to be seen. And this Nalanda monastery, this is going to survive for several centuries before eventually it's going to be destroyed in some of the Muslim conquests centuries later. All right. The last of the great Guptas is Chandagupta, reigns from 455 to 467, appears to have usurped the throne, which, as I said, was most likely the case, not necessarily, but most likely the case by Chandragupta II as well, by having displaced the legitimate crown prince. His mother was likely a concubine or a junior queen, so his brother, Purugupta, would have been the heir to the throne from the senior queen, right? And Skandagupta's own name is going to be effaced from the genealogies. That is, that the Guptas, when they write their genealogy, they do not find him a figure worthy enough to be included in their genealogy. But it is to his credit, once again, that he is going to repel the Huns, because the Huns come in repeated waves. And it is not going to be until some years after the death of Skandagupta that the Huns are finally going to be able to make a breakthrough. Somewhere around, it is estimated around the year 500, 505 approximately, all right? So the decline of the Gupta Empire takes place for reasons that I've suggested now. There's an external challenge, repeated invasions by the Huns, who, as I've said, are known in India as the Hunas. And then there's an internal challenge from the Pushya Mitras, which is a tribal community on the banks of the what is the Narmada River today. This is a tribal community that had acquired substantial political power. So they're pushing north. They're pushing north. The Huns are coming from the west. The Pushyamitras are coming from the south. You have some wars of succession after Chandragupta's death. And then, as I suggested, early 500, 505, 510, the Huns are going to be able to break through. They're going to establish a rule, which lasts very, very short period of time, a few decades. But what it does do is they destroy the cities and trading centers, okay, of North India. So in that sense, even though the Huns ruled for a very short period of time, they inflicted very serious damage. Now, more substantive questions, some of which I've entertained. So I'm going to be brief and quick on these. What was the political structure of the Gupta Empire? So we've already looked at the core area, border kings, tributary princes in some detail. And I suggested to you that there was an administrative structure, which I've given in this PowerPoint here. So you have a governor, then you've got sub provinces. These are divided into districts. The bigger cities have what we would today call mayors. You've got town clerks. You have guilds. You have artisans, and artisans form guilds, and you have the heads of these families of artisans. You have the village headmen, and you have the heads of peasant families. What we're really speaking about is a tiered level of governance. And one implication there is that, which I think I would argue remained true in India for a very long period of time, is that most people in the village, their contact with the state meant contact with the head of the panchayat, the village headman. Maybe at best the tax collector at times. In British times, maybe the tax collector. But anyone on top of that, these were people who were alien to them. They had no knowledge of who they were. And to that extent, you could also say that often justice was administered simply at the local level. This is what the panchayat, in the institution of the panchayat, had historically always meant. The panchayat was, remember, the council of 5 elders, going back to Vedic times. And the panchayat still survives in India down to the present day. And many of the decisions that are decisions taken by the panchayat. There've been thousands of incidents that have been reported, and sometimes they make it to the national newspaper. Sometimes you have to go to a local newspaper or just go to the local gossip channel, as it were. And what kind of decision might be taken by a panchayat? If you have a boy falling in love with a girl and they belong to 2 different caste communities and there's a conflict between the two, well, or they've been put under threat, well, you go to the panchayat to try to see if this matter can be resolved, right? Disputes over loans, disputes over the property line. Many of these disputes are resolved at the hands of the panchayat. The fact that you have sufficient decentralization of power is what I'm trying to really emphasize through that slide. All right. And here what I'm doing is I'm really going back to the points I made, just reinforcing some of them, that the Puranas come into shape, they take their final form. I've suggested in the Gupta period. And there are these different kind of Puranas. We've discussed the fact that they could be Vaishnava, Shaivite, and Shakto. Shakto is the worship of the Devi. We haven't not here looked at, and I can't do that at this juncture, and we would really have to wait until we get into the 7th, 8th century, but we have not really looked at the whole literature which is associated with the Tantric school, all right? But that doesn't really come out of this period. So here, when we speak about sectarian text, because you do have Tantric Puranas too, but those are a little bit later. But when I speak of sectarian texts, I'm really speaking about these Vaishnava Puranas, Shaivite Puranas, and the Devi Puranas. And these Puranas are a massive storehouse of stories, myths, philosophical speculation. They also sometimes give you pilgrimage maps. And when I say maps, I don't mean an actual map, but they'll tell you that if you're a Vaishnava, you want to go for a pilgrimage in the hills of what is now Himachal Pradesh. Well, these are all the sites that you have to go to, and this is the order in which you should see them. All right. And if you're modern day Hindu and you're trying to establish what are the important pilgrimage sites historically, well, how do you do it? One of the ways you do it, you go to the Puranas. And if the same place appears in every Purana, you know that it's an important site. If it appears only in one or two of the Puranas, then you say that, well, the person who wrote this particular text came from this area and thought that this site was important, but none of the other Puranas appear to agree with that. Right? Those are the ways in which you make these kinds of determinations. This was a period of immense religious toleration. So this slide here has two quotations, and I do this deliberately always when I teach, where I give the estimation of two scholars from two very different backgrounds. Because, if I'd given two Indian historians, then someone might say to me, and both of them happen to be Hindu, someone might say to me, isn't it the case that you very conveniently picked two Hindu historians? Are they not likely to give a view which suggested that the Hindus were very tolerant and all of that? And notice I said it's a period of immense religious toleration. I'm not saying only the Hindus are tolerant. If it's a period of religious toleration, it suggests that all the practitioners were exercising tolerance towards each other, right? So I've given two quotations. One is from Max Weber, right? One of the principal European intellectuals of the last 150 years. Literally one of the founders of the whole discipline of sociology. What does he say? It is an undoubted fact that in India, religious and philosophical thinkers were able to enjoy perfect, nearly absolute freedom for a long period. The freedom of thought in ancient India was so considerable as to find no parallel in the West before the most recent age. That's a very generous estimation, very generous. I mean, I think that, there are people who specialize in the study of India who might take a somewhat different view. But Max Weber, who was not a specialist in Indian history or Indian philosophy, but nonetheless was an extremely learned man and even wrote a whole book on India. His view here suggests that this was the commonplace European view and that there was a reason for this view. And then this view is corroborated by someone like A.K. Narayan, who is an Indian historian of that same period that I was mentioning to you before, Radha Kumud Mukherjee, A.S. Artikar, and others. Right? He says that though it cannot be said that there was no religious persecution, he's actually a little bit more moderate, that there may have been some religious persecution, perhaps, but the fact remains that the evidence for persecution is very limited indeed. And the nature of it is such that it pales into insignificance when compared to examples in the history of some other parts of the world, right? Or when compared, in fact, with other periods of Indian history itself. So this is one of the reasons why this period has been known as the Golden Age. We know that Jain temples are raised throughout the empire. We know that Buddhist holy places, Nalanda, remember, is founded at this time, and they were endowments for Hindu temples. And the Guptas themselves, are not really sectarian. That is, that even though they were Vaishnavas, that implication seems to be in that quotation from Fa Hien, if you remember, that the people don't eat any onion or garlic. And I've suggested to you that this means that Vaishnavism was on the rise. But he himself is going to move his capital to a Shaivite city, and many of his ministers were Shaivites. So I think the sectarian split between Vaishnavas and Shaivites was certainly not as acute in the period of the Guptas as it might have been at some other periods. This I have more or less covered, the decline of Buddhism, and I'd actually also spoken about the decline of Buddhism in comparison with the fact that Jainism remained fairly secure. But it has to do the decline with the declining patronage extended to Buddhism, the rise of Hindu kingship, the patronage being extended to Hindus. But it also has to do, as I had suggested when we had looked at Jainism, with the relationship between the laity and the monks, that the relationship in Jainism was far more secure, far closer than it was in Buddhism. And then when you have these monasteries and they become very rich monasteries, it creates a culture of corruption. And I think those were some of the reasons why Buddhism is going to decline. The Gupta period produces extraordinary sculptures, extraordinary sculptures. So this is the seated Gupta from Sarnath, Gupta period about 400. Look at the body. It's slender, rounded, very smooth carving, no muscular contortions at all. His fingers are in the Dharma Chakra Mudra. So, you know, the fingers of the Buddha, when you look at his hands, they're in different mudras, as they're called, and each mudra signifies something. So, for example, it may signify abhay, no fear, for example, right? Or shanti, or Dharma Chakra, which is the preaching mode over here. So this is a sculpture from the Gupta period. This is the standing Buddha. Look at the robes here. Look at the layers of it, right? And the way it's draped. You can see the navel over here. This is all, of course, in stone, right? This is in the Indian Museum in Calcutta, dates to about 500 CE. And moving quickly to the conclusion, because we've really looked at the great achievements. Of course, we could look at some other aspects of it too. You know, the social structures in much greater detail, but there is urbanization going on. We have evidence of public works, of irrigation, roads, bridges. We have evidence of an entire lake being repaired. We know that from inscriptions. That's where inscriptions are really useful. India was part of the Silk Route. You have a silk trade. There's a considerable demand for silk in Rome. And what does Rome send in return to India? What it sends is bullion. Bullion is gold and silver, right? That's what Rome sends in return. I mentioned this here because, you know, if you look at the 17th century, the East India Company trades in India. They take from India. India is famous the world over for textiles, for cotton, for silk, for muslin. Right? They take textiles. They take eventually, of course, India is going to become part of the triangular trade as well. But if you're looking at what Britain could take from India, the serious question becomes, what could Britain send in return? And the answer is nothing. The only thing they could send in return was bullion. Bullion. And this is exactly the situation back in the 4th century. All right. So this is what this slide is meant to convey. There's details here which I will not get into now, but it basically discusses to some extent, you know, the nature of land grants, who they were given to, what rights the Shudras may have had, because remember that Fa Hien's text suggests that caste is now becoming a little bit more consolidated. The system, if I may put it this way, the caste system is becoming more consolidated. That is, that these distinctions between the castes are becoming more watertight. They're becoming more rigorous in some respects. But the Yajnavalkya is one of the lawgivers. He's the Yajnavalkya Smriti suggests that the Shudras under the Guptas began to receive some rights as well, that they had some right of trading, and that women inherited the right to inherit. They had the right to niyog. Niyog is a practice whereby when a woman loses her husband, she can sexually make a home, as it were, with the brother of her previous husband. Okay, so that's the right to niyog. And there's some description in some of these texts what the source of revenue was. I mentioned, for example, tributes from deputed kings before, but there's also land revenue. excise tax. It's mentioned in the Yajnavalkya Smriti. There was gambling. Gambling was regulated by the state. The state did not prohibit it. If you regulate it, well, then one of the advantages to the state is that you collect revenue. And this is one reason why modern states usually will regulate gambling rather than prohibit it, because it's a major source of revenue. And you also have, you have almost no architecture surviving from this period, almost none. Whatever temples there may have been were largely destroyed. This is one of the few remaining temples from that period. Most of the great temples we have, for example, South Indian temples, the South Indian temple cities, we saw a few slides of those. Those are from a later period, 10th century, roughly around 1000, the Cholas, for example. But there were obviously temples, there would have been temples, in the Gupta period, but we don't really have. This one is one of the few surviving examples. It's in Deoghar in UP and dates back to about 500 CE. The PowerPoint you have will give you a little description of what kind of temple this is. Okay, and that's a frontal view. This is a close-up of one of the. So what are a few problems in the study of the Guptas? The sources are slanted towards the study of the elites. That's a problem. This is a problem for many periods of history, particularly when you go back to antiquity, because you have inscriptions. The inscriptions will tell you about the exploits of the conquest of the king, but what does it tell you about everyday life? Right? Very little. So the sources will tell you more about marriage alliances between the elites, the conquest of the kings. It may tell you something about temple grants that are being given. Now, I'm not saying that there's nothing there, because we have some evidence, and that's what this previous slide over here is meant to do, this one here, okay, and this slide over here, that there's some evidence, right? How do we find out about religious toleration? We have to really look at a whole range of inscriptions and texts. But on the whole, the evidence is slim, and it is largely slanted towards the elites, the well-to-do. You have panegyrics, I've explained to you. You have kinship and panegyrics. We cannot draw too many inferences about the lower orders of society. What was life like for the ordinary tradesman, craftsman? What kind of relationship did these people have with their wives? What was the average size of the Indian family? We obviously cannot say that. For hundreds of years to come, we won't be able to say that. And even when you're doing European history, where generally I would say that, particularly when you start to get into the 12th, 13th century, you find that the sources are going to be substantially richer. Even there, we're not able to say that much about the lower orders of society, right? So we have to have a critical look at the epigraphic evidence. And I have already suggested to you the problems of nationalism and European templates in shaping our view of the Guptas. All right, and then you get to the question of chronology. So when you say the Gupta Empire, so remember the days we were saying that, oh well, look, about 467. All right, that's really the last of the 5 great Guptas, but I've given you the outer limit was 550. And that's because there are shades of it. Although the Huns or the Hunas have made a breakthrough. And by 500 to 510, the Guptas are pretty much, on the way out, all right? But technically, it dates to 550. Now, but if we say that it's really at the border, 467, okay? So if you look at the Ajanta cave paintings, which date to about 460 to 477, now, should these be considered part of the Gupta legacy, or should they be viewed as something which point to a very different legacy and a much older legacy, although they're painted around this period of time, right? And what am I speaking about here? This is what I'm really speaking about. I mean, this is one of the most extraordinary artistic inheritances of India. This is Ajanta Cave 16, where this shows this has been, of course, this was destroyed, or over a period of time suffered damage, and considerable damage over here. There's still some restoration work that has been done. Restoration work has to be done very, very carefully. I mean, this is a matter of extraordinary expertise to do this kind of restoration work because of the kind of materials that you use, the kind of colors that you use. Um, but this shows a scene from the life of the Buddha, okay, where he's receiving kheer, from Sujata. All right, so this is mentioned in some of the stories that we know about the Buddha. And I'm saying to you, when I'm looking at this painting, well, is this a Gupta? Is this a legacy of the Gupta? Because it was painted just at the cusp, right? So when we say Gupta period, we have to have some understanding of how we are going to interpret these terms and what it means to speak of something as belonging to the Gupta period. Because clearly, I think we have to say that, look, the story comes from a much earlier time. The question is, were there artistic techniques of this kind even before, but maybe those works didn't survive? I mean, and even Ajanta and Ellora were completely unknown for centuries, like the story of Ashoka. For centuries, no one knew about it. I mean, there was covered by dense jungle growth, right? But there may be other works, they may be earlier, possibly. This, again, from the same period, from cave 17, an amorous palace scene. Here you see a princely figure. It's supposed to represent the Nandas, the pre-Mauryan kings. Okay, and he's got his hand around her waist and breast. So that's the amorous scene here, right? These are the paintings that I'm speaking about when I'm speaking about the Ajanta, the caves. All right, and for me, this is probably the most supreme work of art from that period, because the sheer serenity, the sheer, this is the rasa of shanti, right? Peace, that rasa that I've spoken about. Here you see monkeys in the background. What is this? Is the representation of the bodhisattva, right? Avalokiteshvara Padampani. And the bodhisattvas are there, to once again, these are, you might describe them as the incarnations who help us along, in times of distress, right? That's a common colloquial way to think about who the bodhisattvas are. But I'm concluding with this because I'm suggesting to you that there are some problems that we would have to think about in the study of the Gupta period. And of course, there are problems in the study of any period, but these are the problems that are particular to the study of the Gupta period. All right, I think that brings us to an end.
Right. Interesting. So just a few questions. So basically, the decline of the Guptas happened because that last person we discussed in this whole Gupta dynasty, the Chandgragupta.
Yes, yeah.
After him, basically there was
minor. The Guptas become minor kings. They're no longer presiding over a big empire. So they're still there, some of them, but it's like how it started. It started with two minor kings who are not really part of the big legacy, right? Yeah. And it ends with what become minor kings, really minor kings. And what is the reason for the decline? The two biggest reason is the constant attacks, okay? The constant attacks from the Huns. So you have the external invasion, but they're repelled, but eventually these are going to weaken them. All right, so even though the Huns are repelled successfully over a period of several decades before they eventually make a breakthrough, right? But what's happening is that the state is expending a large number of its resources, financial resources, its military, its revenues, right? And then you have and then on the south of the Guptas, you have the Pushyamitras who are pushing up north, right? Those are some of what you might describe as military and territorial reasons. But then, of course, I think the other reasons for the decline, and I don't think the historians have written sufficiently about it really as such, but I think the other reasons for the decline have to do with with the fact that empires really fundamentally are sustained over a period of 150, 200 years. That's what you typically find. They're not sustained for a period that is longer than that. You could also say that the Guptas had served their purpose at that point. What was the purpose that they had served? The purpose they had served was they had helped in bringing Hinduism back into the fold. Back into the fold. And remember, of course, this is a little bit before, but beginning 700, you get a new element in Indian history, completely new element. And that element could only come in because what you had was you had already enormous fragmentation. What is that new element? Islam, coming of Islam. Now, that's not a factor, of course, in the decline of the Guptas, but I'm saying to you that if you think about it historically, you think about what happens, right? That this is what I mean when I say they run their course. I think they had run their course. The stage was now being set for another new element to come in a sense. And then, of course, you have these external aggression, and you have internal. And I'm describing the Pushyamitra as internal because they're not coming from Central Asia. They're coming from the Deccan. This is a tribal confederation, and they're coming from the south, from the Deccan, from the